Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/capsulate today to request a demo.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list and join our Discord server. And if you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And now we come to the news. And John, a lot of the news this week is talking about some programming languages. And this felt dangerous to say while we were still talking with Alyssa. But if I do have an allergy, I'm allergic to Perl code. So that's the one thing we need to worry about. But there's a couple different things that I think are sort of a theme to build around. And I'm going to start just talking one article about the bug bounty program of last resort. This was two researchers sort of proposing the idea of what if we just put together a whole lot of money and just had a bug bounty program for all of the vulns that aren't being sponsored by corporations or don't have deep pockets because they're open source code, things like that. And rather than get into the details of sort of what they were presenting or the numbers that they were using, for example, they're saying, potentially there's sinking $1.7 billion into this to cover a lot of what the vulnerabilities were throughout 2020. I'm kind of curious, should we be investing in just finding more of the vulns, or what if we actually invested on the securing the hardware side or having more hands on keyboard, so to speak, writing that code? And I'm not sure if that kind of resonates with you or what your thoughts on this might be.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, so from a few different angles in here, the idea initially of having the last resort concept, that's sort of cool. And then as you were just talking, I started realizing, I mean, we've had that for 20 years, and it's called CERT, at least in the US. But now it's just you're putting money, not just being that last resort. So I don't know. That's interesting. I think I sort of agree with what you're hinting at there, the concept of at some point you can't just keep throwing money at that's I don't think that's going to be a complete solution. Just always sort of dangling the carrot of money. It'll work to get researchers not selling their stuff, hopefully in the black market. I think that's one of the reasons you do that, is to have some sort of a more public bug bounty, so we can fix the issues. Right. I can't talk common problem, but I think I'm with you. I'd love to see a little more on the other side of that coin. And it's funny, Alyssa mentioned something there that caught my ears. You guys are having a great conversation, so I wasn't interrupting. We've had, I think, the last 2 or 3 weeks now, we've had guests saying that we need to be investing more on the training side. And while, thinking about my last org or two, haven't been doing actual trainings to developers like that, security training. I was teaching security training classes, a decade ago. So I know it's there. I know it's popular, or I know it's existed. I know it's becoming more popular. But that's sort of, it seems like that's one of those trends that's sort of sticking its head up the last month or so. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if that continues this year. The need, or the advertised need.
No, that's interesting. And there was, I didn't want to make this episode all of the Google Project Zero articles, of the week, but there was another security on Google's security blog that I didn't post, so I'll have to post it after this. They're talking about their no prevent fix framework for about open source security, and they basically wanted to say, Google's saying we want to put some more essentially burden on open source projects in the idea that we should know who's committing consequential code. We should have code reviews for critical code paths. And they're basically saying the idea that open source projects, because they are critical, and they have lots of supply chain implications, we should have some commensurate security around them. I think it was kind of interesting, and I'm trying to tie it to what you were saying, both in the sense of just what secure coding is, there's a training, but also that idea of investment. It's one thing for us to say in this case, talk about what's a bug bounty of last resort, spending money there, or there's another article just about Google was spending $6.7 million on bug bounties just for their own software, Android, Chrome, some of their other properties. But John, you've made the point a couple times, I think it was the end of last year, maybe we started off this year, about Microsoft's security budget and where that is being spent. So I think that where I'm kind of going at with this is that it's interesting that we have, on the one hand, a call to say, let's put more into bug bounty just so we can pay for all of the vulns that come out, and hopefully we get those vulns off of the gray market, so to speak. And here's another call from Google to say we need more maturity within open source development. But there's not a money investment in that. It's not saying necessarily that we're going to actually assign more developers. We're going to put more money into, rather than fixing yet another bug, re-architecting the code to make that better. And I'm going with that is sort of that difference between OpenSSL and boring SSL, for example. Or we have something like ImageMagick, or a lot of these, pick any image parser, video parser, or PDF parser for that matter. Why don't we rewrite them into something like Rust or like that is a bit more memory safe to avoid a lot of the vulnerabilities that we've seen historically?
Yeah, you really just said a bunch of interesting things at once, which is really not like you. No, I'm kidding. So first, let's go back to let's see if I can remember that on the open source thing. I'm actually going to make a note about that one. So on the previous topic there, still the same topic, the first half of it. In a way, what we're talking about on this bug bounty of last resort, that could almost be seen as a government program, which would have, whether it's actually government run or not, a governing body would be running something like that. How does it get funded? It's going to have to collect something like taxes. So, and maybe that's a consortium, maybe it's just the biggest players. It'd be really interesting to see what's Google's security budget. I haven't seen that number. I might have to go digging around because that's got to be up there too, right? And then the last thought I had there, sort of bringing those two together, is again sort of around governance. Linux Foundation is I think it's LX. I think it's lfx.dev. Is they're working on sort of a collection of tools for open source projects, and they're doing some stuff in their security. And I think we're hopefully going to have one of their folks on in a few weeks to sort of talk a little more depth about that. But Apache, Linux Foundation, all these large CNCF, all these large orgs that it's sort of resembling what you have at a company, right, where you have the security group, because it is hard to get these folks in every single team or get everyone tested. So that could be a positive reason to, if you're on the open source side, to get your project into one of these larger groups. And then really back to your question, not that I'm not trying to blow it off. Generally, I tend to not be a fan of when I see a new project that's written in a different language. So we saw this when Python came out back, about 15 years ago. All the Perl scripts were being rewritten in Python, especially startups and stuff like that. And I think, usually I'm not a big fan of that. But when we're actually switching to a language that's going to make something more secure like Rust, that gives me, or actually, like what Microsoft is doing, where they're taking the sensitive parts of their applications, or I should say the more potentially vulnerable, and they're switching those over to Rust. So I think I'm a big fan of that. If you're doing it with reason beyond just you're bored this weekend.
Yes, doing it within reason. And I think even because last week we even talked about the iMessage and blast doors, and that wasn't a language rewrite, that was an architecture rewrite. And I think that's where I tend to be much more a fan of and care less about choice of language and more about what's being used. And further talk about this point, there was another pair of articles I posted from the Enigma Conference. One was about talking about memory unsafety issues, and the other was from Maddie Stone on Project Zero, talking about just what they have seen over the past year of 0 days. On the memory unsafety side, we'll start with that first. The presentation made a good point at the beginning, talking about, again, try not to make this the Google show this week, but some research that Google was showing that security keys were pretty much 100% successful against preventing account takeover attacks. So there were SMS codes still pretty good, TOTP codes still pretty good, but drop in a hardware token like a YubiKey, for example, pretty much you don't have to worry about ATOs. And so the idea there, point to be made, is that we've gotten rid of a class of vulnerabilities. What the rest of this presentation was saying is that there's this other class of vulnerabilities called memory unsafety, buffer, heap, etc. And they're all in, pretty much C and C++ code. Now, some of my reaction to this is partially we just have a massive population of applications out there that just so happen to be written in C and C++ code. So that's kind of where the vulns are. Alyssa was telling us about BOLA vulnerabilities. There's plenty of web application vulnerabilities that are very consequential for our personal data, financial data, health data, etc. That have nothing to do with these. But if we're talking on the idea of Chrome, Firesoft, there are a lot of these. So that's sort of where it ties into some language. And if you to look through these slides yet, or if you had a different reaction to that. Because if not,
no. Yeah, no. I only glanced at them, unfortunately. I want to go back and read these a little closer.
Yeah.
But going back to. I mean, I get the point of I was sort of focusing on the first one, the memory unsafety. The point of that is interesting, and again, Alyssa was talking about buffer overflows decreasing. I think they're on the website. I don't think they are in general. I just did a search on my mailbox and just looking at all the different advisories out there coming in. We're still seeing a pretty good chunk of buffer overflows, and I think in one of our next stories we're actually going to be talking about a few of them. So as much as we want it to go away, and as much of the C tooling and all the different make tooling and our linters are helping with that, I think there's still that issue out there that needs to be addressed, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this is where I thought I just kind of wanted, despite me talking quite a bit about the memory unsafety presentation, I wanted to just hit that briefly and highlight the other presentation from Enigma about the state of 0 day in the wild exploitation. And I think that kind of ties to the bug bounty of last resort, investments, because here was Maddie Stone, a researcher at Project Zero, talking about the importance of variant analysis and pointing out that one of the quotes from it, 1 out of every 4 detected 0 day exploits could potentially have been avoided if a more thorough investigation and patching effort were explored. And I thought that was a really great point, because it's the idea that, sure, we may have a lot of, call them memory and safety vulnerabilities, but if we're just playing that whack-a-mole to fix them one at a time, or as is common, and we've seen this in a couple articles we've even covered here with some of like Microsoft Kerberos and a couple others, sometimes the patches don't actually fix the underlying problem, or the patches then have to have patches for the patches because the vulnerability is still exploitable with a little bit of a variant. And this is one of the points she's making. And this is why, to me, this is what highlighted my reaction to that first bug bounty article, the idea that I don't know that I would invest necessarily just in finding more of the vulns, as well as investing someone to be tasked with how pervasive is this? Or was this one-line fix the best fix we could have done, or something else? Yeah. And that's where, too, I'm not even getting to that idea as I keep interrupting you. I hear you trying to get in. It doesn't even feel to me like we need to rewrite it in a different language. Perhaps we just need to be better about the languages we're writing in from a security architecture point of view.
Yeah, and you're not cutting me off. I was just saying yeah. But I'm fully with you on that. And the phrase I've used in a few talks that I'm pretty fond of is really when you go after these things, to do it with intention. And by that, I mean, you're not just, when the bug comes through saying there's a buffer overflow in line 50 and whatever. Again, one of my things I always say in here is we're all pressed for time, but this is one of those, right? We know you're pressed. You got to get that bug resolved and move on. But man, if the vast majority of us don't have Google scale code bases or Microsoft scale or Oracle scale or whatever, right? We're looking. Our code bases are probably within hundreds of thousands. I'd say tens to hundreds, if not maybe low millions lines for most of us, the projects we're working on. It doesn't take that much time to either do a grep or a find or what have you, just to go through the code and go, am I seeing that pattern somewhere else? And I think this is something, as I think about it, GitHub, one of their acquisitions last year with, was it SemGrep? Yeah, SemGrep, right? Where they've actually added a tool in to help you. I think, or actually, that might be a separate company. So sorry, that's where Clint is, right? But that ability to have a tool that just go and grep for these patterns. You know what's there. You know what's causing the problem. Once you see it one place in your code, the chance of it just being in that one place is, again, last hour, as we said, we're humans and we'll repeat things all the time. So if I write a piece of code, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to write something, even if I rewrite, not copy and paste, it's going to be pretty similar. So if I write it in a few different functions or a few different bits, I'm probably going to make that same mistake. So, okay, let's actually fix it with intention and go through and actually find those things. And I wish we did a bit more of that. I know it, like I said, time, but I agree with you. I think that'd be a little bit better spend of some of this money than just whack-a-mole on the other side.
Yeah. So switching to, there's another article here from Salt. And they were talking sort of another state of security, this time API security. And I think this was a nice, different perspective than memory unsafety issues, as they're looking at APIs, something we were just talking about with Alyssa. And one of the things that stood out for me in particular about this was they throw a bunch of percentages out there, a bunch of statistics, but one was that of what they saw, 96% of API exploits happen against authenticated APIs. And to me, that's pretty interesting. One, for the aspect of, especially if you have a dynamic scanner, you need to have a scanner that can handle such things, authentication. But it was also just pretty interesting is that where am I going with this? As you're doing testing, security testing, building the testing, are you able to exercise those particular workflows to be able to find those types of authentication or authorization types of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, and again, talking about, it's funny, I've been interviewing a few folks recently, interviewing for a hiring, not just interviewing for a podcast. And one of the areas we keep digging into, we have a homework problem we like to give people, and it's basically, write something fairly simple, not too difficult, and then give us a demo of it. And it's interesting to see always how people approach the authentication part of this. It uses a third-party service, so you'd have to use OAuth, but then how are they taking that OAuth token? Are they just throwing it into the URL? Are they actually doing a JWT? Are they watching for DOS attacks if they're not validating where that token's coming from? So there's a bunch of sort of common patterns here that, it's not the goal of the assignment, but I'll ask a question or two when I see something like, did you think about this, or could you think about how to improve it? And my interview style is, for the vast majority of you lucky enough not to be interviewed by me, I tend to be fairly laissez-faire, and I just give people, I throw a question out there and just I want to see how they answer. Are they thinking about it? How would they approach it? Because a lot of these things we don't know the answers, right? I asked someone just this morning if she had more time and her boss had just given her the question I gave her, how would she go about researching it? And she said Google. I'm like, okay, that's great, but I'm like, well, is there a place you usually go after that? Like, what is there, like a favorite for this language, whatever else? And like her first response was Medium. It's like, okay, cool. That tells me that she's actually done this and she knows how to do it and she knows where to go find things, which I think is more important for a lot of this stuff, right? And again, but it's hard. You have to be open-minded and understand that you're not perfect to be able to say, maybe this isn't the best way to write this. And this is where code reviews come in handy in your company, because someone else might see, okay, you did the authentication, but did you actually validate that now that you've got a valid user, is that user the owner of that object that you're about to return back or delete or whatever else? So Yeah, there's a lot to do there, right? So again, this is probably a little bit like an open SSL type problem, wherein that you have to have not just that surface level, but actually be a little more in depth and know what you're doing to do it right. That analogy was a little vague at the end, but I hope that makes sense.
No, I think it does make sense. It also sets up a great segue to talk about one of the other articles from Capsulate this time, establishing a scalable collaboration between security and DevOps. And the reason I thought that was a good thing to tie to what you were just saying is that one of the things this article was highlighting was some research from 451 Group, I think it was that it has an interesting list of skill sets, and the phrase that was posed, or the question that was posed, was how adequately represented are these skill sets? And one of those items was security architecture. And for me, I would love to see that improve. And I think that kind of speaks to just what you were saying just now, is like, how are you, a developer, thinking of a particular problem, thinking of testing it, thinking of approaching it, thinking of just even learning more about it, to make it, a more secure, to make it more secure. So that stood out for me. And the other part of it was interesting, is that penetration testing was on there, but that also comes around to the idea of, where do we invest? Do we really need to have penetration and testing invested as part of our internal team's skill set, or would that be something great to just invest in from a vendor externally? So it's kind of just some interesting things there about where people are thinking of for what their security-minded DevOps teams might look like.
Yeah, where do I start? So a pen tester, I'll say pen testers. Let's go try and more generalize it, but I think of pen testers as, unless you're a really large org that has blue teams and red teams, and you can actually support that and support getting those really hard to find people, it's just like visual designers, I think, graphic designers, either UI or print, in that I think they should be in a separate third-party agency that you contract to. And what you get out of that is that agency. I mean, it's consulting, you have to engage a consultant correctly, but presuming you're doing that part, the consultancy, it's their job to go and find those folks and keep them entertained. And we got an article in here about NCC, talk about a perfect analogy. But also, hopefully they will rotate those people through. So as you have different engagements with them, you're going to have different people doing different pen tests. So, Joe maybe is really fond of SQLi and finds those all the time. Maybe Sarah is really great at finding cross-site scripting issues. So as you get different people testing that, and it's really hard to get that combination side of a company. But in general, I went hard right on the pen test thing here. But in general, I think pen test is sort of lower on that list of things in this report. This is interesting. After we had, I think it was Radware a month or so ago, was talking about hiring security expertise was number 3 on their list after buying their product. Funny that. But so, yeah, IoT, security, DevOps, security architecture. I'm with you on security architecture. It's tough to do, man. It's actually getting a company to slow down and say, hey, we need to bring security arc in here. You got to have a pretty good grip on the horns of that bull. Cloud platform expertise. We've seen this for the last probably 5 years now. So that's continuing to go. I think people are realizing, probably after last year, people are really going to start going to that cloud. So, yeah, interesting paper though.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and just from where people are thinking of. And I don't have. We have an article from NCC Group. I'd possibly save that for last. I did want to touch on one more article from or presentation from Enigma, and this I think ties a little bit maybe to, not so much maybe to architecture. So it's going to be a reach there, but it hits my buttons in the sense of the visualization and communication of security. And in this case, is talking about basically nutrition labels. So this is our metaphor of the day, or metaphor episode. But nutrition labels for privacy and security. And what I thought was pretty interesting is that, one, that's a big challenge. How do you convey that in a concise manner? And Two, what do you emphasize? Like, what's important, and how do you just explain that to a wide range of an audience that maybe is not an expert to, old, late, early 90s frac articles and don't really care about IoT other than it's three letters and it makes my camera turn on or it makes my music play. And so looking at the slides, I think the slides weren't numbered, but looking at one of the labels, it's interesting how they break down into they talk about purpose, or they talk about data just stored on device. What data is stored in the cloud? Who's the data shared with? Who's the data sold to? And I thought that was kind of an interesting approach to just explaining what's in the box of these devices from both the security and a bit more from the privacy angle as well.
Yeah, I'm actively very interested in this topic. It's funny, I didn't get a chance to see the slides till this weekend. One of my hats right now, so CNCF has one of their special interest groups is SIGApp delivery operations. They're working on SIGApp app delivery. They're working on an operator white paper for what's CNCF's status on operators and best practices and stuff like that. I'm helping with Chapter 4, which is the operator security. And a plug, we're always looking for more people in that working group, so reach out to me if you want to come and chat with us weekly about what operator security should look like. But one of the things I was talking about last week, just coincidentally, is it'd be really great if we had some sort of standard or something for literally this exact same thing on the security side, especially for open source projects, right, where you're like, I'm getting this thing, I'm running it in my cloud, I'm running it in my Kubernetes cluster with a bunch of privileges. What is it? Do I have time to review it? Is it from a good source? What is it doing with my cluster? So the privacy aspect of this is interesting. That's I think there's folks already working on that, I think. Well, obviously, yeah, the Apple and stuff like that. But the security side, I haven't heard of folks outside of this paper yet talk about this. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in this. I think this is especially, we've talked about API today, we've talked about cloud, all these type of things. As you have all these moving parts, you really need something like this, I think, to make our lives a little easier.
No, and speaking of possibly the opposite of making our lives easier is the research summary of 2021 from NCC Group. And the reason I say that is there's a lot to read there. I think it's a great resource covering everything from cryptography, open source tooling, hardware embedded systems, to cloud and containers, to data science, public interest, and reducing vulnerabilities at scale. So sort of like, pick any or all of those dimensions, and there's quite a bit of interesting reading there. For me, I glommed on to mostly the crypto section. I'll admit, partially because it was first and I was being lazy, but also because those are interesting vulnerabilities that we see, and these are vulnerabilities in implementation or vulnerabilities in design, and these are pretty independent of whatever programming language you've used. And so that to me is why these kind of are always of interest. And so, John, I'm not sure what stood out to you on this massive list, or what's the area that you think you might dive into?
This thing is a fire hose of stuff to cover. I mean, we could do probably 2 or 3 podcasts on this thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like you, I've started reading, and the first section was cryptography, and my thoughts on that. So I scrolled back up to the top and realized I had a table of contents. So I've been sort of skipping around this talk, and so I've looked over the cloud stuff. I've looked at the open source tools, which there's some interesting ones in there. It's fun to see some of these. I think historically we've always had point tools, and then, like we talked about, the bigger things like the Metasploits come along, that the frameworks. It's interesting. It seems like the last year or so, and maybe it's just on the Kubernetes side or the cloud side, I'm starting to see individual tools come back. So they're not so much exploits, but they're independently developed. They start off as something a little simple, probably a weekend project, and they're sort of going into something a little bigger. So I think that's pretty cool. Anybody who wants to, literally it'd be fun to see how big this is if you print this out. It's got to be 100 pages. But there's a ton of good stuff in it.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be fair to any of our listeners to read through that, because it was 96 papers, 47 presentations. But pick something out, and as John said, let us know what was interesting, because we could easily have a couple of shows just on several of those topics. So with that, hopefully my connection isn't struggling too much. So John, maybe we'll make you talk a little bit more. You mentioned the special interest group. Anything else that you wanted to draw attention to this week? We have, I think, next Monday off, so we have a 2-week gap. What should people go read about or dive into?
Yeah, like I said, I'd be getting a little more active in CNCF. We're about to start coming into security season, right? I guess another month or so before we start hitting the RSA and that type of thing. I think really, if I was going to point someone to something for next week or so, just keep yourself busy with this NCC paper. There's lots of stuff that we never got around to covering last year, and they've got a lot of it in here.
Sounds great. Well, we've fortunately, I think, got around to covering all of the articles this week, so that was fantastic. I want to thank all of our listeners for once again joining us, and as always, thank you, John, for joining me. We'll see you in 2 weeks on Application Security Weekly.